On behalf of the American Society of International Law, I'd like to welcome you to today's webcast, Nuclear Security and Non-Proliferation. I'm Lucinda Lowe, the president of the American Society of International Law, and we're here at Tiller House, the headquarters of the Society in Washington, D.C. Today's event is the seventh of a series the Society has been presenting this year on international law and the Trump administration. The Society is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization founded in 1906 and chartered by the United States Congress in 1950. Our mission is to educate about international law and to promote international relations on the basis of law and justice. This webcast is in furtherance of that mission. The series is designed to provide information to people in the U.S. and around the world who want to have a better understanding of the key international law issues that we face today. And today's topic is certainly one of those. Since the development of nuclear capability at the end of World War II, international law has consistently been a tool to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and other multilateral agreements are examples of this effort. Of course, there's also bilateral agreements, such as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action between the U.S. and Iran, finalized during the Obama administration, and the New START Treaty between the United States and Russia. Now, the Trump administration has raised concerns about the effectiveness of some of these agreements and the past approach, but unlike in other areas, has not yet acted to repudiate such agreements. But we all wake up to the newspapers and the conduct of states such as North Korea, which raises new concerns about nuclear threats, making this issue a very live one with potentially far-reaching consequences, not only for the United States, but for the world. We could not imagine a series on the administration and international law without going into this important topic. As with our prior sessions, today's speakers are people who have deep knowledge about and experience with these issues from both sides of the political aisle. As our speakers will be introduced by the moderator, I will not go into their backgrounds, but I'd like to thank them and the moderator for joining us today. Our moderator, David Koplow, is with Georgetown University Law Center, and he's also a former special counsel for arms control in the Office of General Counsel at the U.S. Department of Defense. So let me now turn it over to David to take this webcast forward and introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucinda, and thanks as well to the other staff and experts here at the American Society of International Law for organizing this truly marvelous series of programs on international law and the Trump administration. For today's episode, we're going to be focusing on nuclear security and nuclear non-proliferation, which is surely one of the most important issues for this series of programs. It's a set of problems that has always been identified as the very top rank of issues of concern and importance and urgency. And today, fortunately, we have with us two extraordinary experts who are able to help us make sense out of some of the problems in this very complicated cluster of issues. I'll introduce them only briefly, far too briefly in view of their many qualifications and experiences in the field, but we want to dive as quickly as we can into the substance of the discussions. Stephen Rademacher is now Senior of Counsel at Covington and Burling. He is a former Assistant Secretary of State for International Security and Non-Proliferation, a former Chief Counsel for the House Select Committee on Homeland Security, and a former General Counsel at the Peace Corps. Lynn Rustin is now Senior Consultant at the Nuclear Threat Institute. Before that, she was the Senior Director for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation on the NSC staff, the Chief of Staff for the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation at the State Department, and a Senior Professional Staff Member for the Senate Armed Services Committee. Both are speaking today in their individual and personal capacities, not necessarily representing the views of any current or former agencies, employers, or associates. So let's begin. As I indicated, this cluster of issues having to do with WMD proliferation and security, it has always been identified as one of the top priorities for national security policy and international affairs, but the specific applications of those principles in any particular context have always been controversial. So let's start with a general tour of the horizon, identifying some of the big picture concerns that are confronting the Trump administration and the international community, and then we'll drill down into the specifics. Lynn, we'll start with you. As you look around the world today, what do you identify as the top priorities for government attention?
Thanks, David, and thanks for having me here. I'll list kind of the top 5 non-proliferation or nuclear risk issues that I'm focused on, and not necessarily in rank order, but maybe close, and with some sense of, I tend to think in terms of what are the trend lines in terms of, is an issue getting better or getting worse? At the top of the list, I put North Korea. Of course, there's tremendous focus, and there was on the front page of the Washington Post today, on North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. So that's got to be at the top of the list. I also am very concerned about the combustible combination of the deterioration of our relations with Russia, ours and kind of the West more broadly, with nuclear weapons. Our conventional military forces bumping up against each other in the European theater, and what the risks might be of potential conflict there, not to mention sort of the long-term reliability of deterrence. An issue that's maybe not getting a lot of attention at the moment, but on which we need to keep focus on, is South Asia. The nuclear weapons in Pakistan and India, both in terms of the competition between them, and then the nexus between Pakistan's programs and terrorism, because as we know, there are several terrorist groups that are based in Pakistan. And then that leads me into my 4th issue, which is the broader concern of impeding the acquisition of weapons of mass destruction by terrorist groups. That's something that we just need to stay vigilant on as a current and long-term task. And then finally, but importantly, is Iran, which 2 years ago I would have probably had higher up on the list, and is still obviously a great concern to ensure that Iran does not progress towards development of a nuclear weapon. But with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action agreement between the 5 other countries and ourselves with Iran, that is in a much better place. And I would argue that's we need to keep Iran in compliance with the agreement, and that situation is improved as a result.
So, Steve, that's an ambitious agenda for the administration and for our 1-hour program. Does that seem right to you, or are there items you'd care to add?
I think that list is basically correct. I'd like to sort of put the issue in perspective, though. First of all, why is this an important issue? The reason it's important is it's an issue we need to get right. And if we get the issue of nuclear weapons wrong, millions or tens of millions of people could die. So, I mean, that's why it's an important issue. It's about survival potentially of civilization as we know it. Now, we're fortunate that, contrary to some predictions that were made, President Kennedy, I guess, famously predicted that by the 1970s there could be as many as 25 countries with nuclear weapons. That hasn't happened, and part of the reason it hasn't happened is because agreements were negotiated to prevent or at least restrain the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Most importantly, a treaty called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT. And so today, there are 5 countries that are permitted under the NPT to have nuclear weapons. That's the United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China. Those were the 5 countries that had nuclear weapons at the time that treaty was signed. It's a nearly universal treaty. I think there are only 5 countries today that are outside that haven't ratified it, and one of those is South Sudan. I'm not sure why the Obama administration never asked South Sudan to sign it, but then there are 4 others that are believed to have nuclear weapons: North Korea, India, Pakistan, and Israel. They're not part of the treaty.
It's worth noting that North Korea was and withdrew.
But withdrew from the treaty. And there's an argument about whether they complied with the proper procedures for withdrawing and whether their withdrawal was valid or not. But under international law, there would have been a mechanism for them to withdraw. And so with respect to those 4 countries, the fact that they have nuclear weapons is contrary to the spirit of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it's not a violation of the treaty, with the possible exception of North Korea, if one believes they didn't withdraw properly. But that's sort of a long-term problem. I mean, we'd like to get everybody, including the countries in South Asia, which you mentioned, in India and Pakistan, would like to get them into the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as non-nuclear weapon states, meaning they would have to give up their nuclear weapons. But that's sort of a longer-term goal, and the more immediate problem is making sure that the countries that are in the treaty today and that today have a legal obligation not to possess nuclear weapons continue to abide by that obligation. Fundamentally, there's very good news, which is most countries don't want nuclear weapons, and you can count on one hand the number of countries you actually worry about trying to obtain nuclear weapons, and it includes some of the countries that you mentioned, Iran, which has been embarked on a nuclear weapons program for about 2 decades, North Korea, which today has nuclear weapons. I mean, they pulled out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and have tested nuclear weapons. So those are the 2 most immediate threats. Now, there's some other countries that in the past have flirted with nuclear weapons. I mean, Libya had an active nuclear weapons program until that was turned off. Syria apparently was pursuing nuclear weapons until the Israelis bombed the nuclear reactor they were using to advance their program. There was suspicion at one point that Burma, which was another sort of isolated country, was pursuing or interested in pursuing nuclear weapons. In the past, there were some other countries, South Africa actually had nuclear weapons, but they gave them up. Argentina and Brazil at one point had active nuclear weapons programs. They gave them up. So
and Iraq.
And Iraq absolutely had a very active nuclear weapons program, which got bombed, but actually Saddam Hussein brought it back. And after the first Persian Gulf War, the international community was astonished to learn how close Saddam Hussein was actually to possessing nuclear weapons in 1991. But the larger story here is basically a good one, that a lot of these countries that in the past had an interest in acquiring nuclear weapons have gotten past that. And that's a good thing. Iran, I think we fear, hasn't gotten past it. North Korea, we know, hasn't gotten past it. And so that's the initial concern. And I'd go on and say that in terms of further proliferation, I think the greatest risk is if we fail to constrain the nuclear weapons ambitions of Iran and North Korea, some of their immediate neighbors they need nuclear weapons too as a matter of self-defense. And so on the Korean Peninsula, we have to worry about South Korea over the long term. Now, according to public opinion surveys in in South Korea, pretty consistently about 2/3 of the South Korean people say South Korea should have nuclear weapons, because they live next to a country that has nuclear weapons, and those weapons are aimed in part at South Korea. And 2/3 of South Koreans think the proper thing for them to do is to arm themselves with nuclear weapons to be able to confront that threat. That would be a really bad development for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty for South Korea to conclude that the only resort they had to defend themselves was to deploy nuclear weapons. Now, they are under the American nuclear umbrella. So in large measure, what stands in the way of the majority sentiment in South Korea translating itself into a South Korean nuclear weapons program is the fact that America has nuclear weapons. America has given a security guarantee to South Korea, and South Korea today relies on the threat that if South Korea is attacked with nuclear weapons or by North Korea in a way that poses a threat to their survival as a country, the United States will defend them up to the use of nuclear weapons if necessary. And this is a point that's often forgotten. A lot of people think that the problem in the nuclear proliferation area is that the United States and Russia have nuclear weapons. Well, I would actually argue that in a context like on the Korean Peninsula, the American nuclear arsenal is the largest deterrent to nuclear weapons proliferation, because South Korea certainly has the technology. They have one of the largest civil nuclear programs in the world. If they wanted nuclear weapons, there wouldn't be much we can do to stop them from achieving them. What we need to do is create incentives and disincentives so that they decide they can continue to rely on the American nuclear umbrella. And so far, we've succeeded in that, notwithstanding the very threatening developments right across the border from them in North Korea.
So
with regard to Iran, very similar problem. If Iran succeeds in achieving a nuclear weapons capability, there are a number of other countries in Iran's neighborhood that may well decide they need nuclear weapons too. And we need to give a lot of thought to how we will discourage that should Iran acquire a nuclear weapon. And there I just want to disagree with something you said, Lynn. I think the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was negotiated during the Obama administration with Iran, it gives us, in the near term, it gives us breathing room. It gives us about 10 years where we can reduce our level of anxiety about Iran producing a nuclear weapon. After 10 years, or after 12 or 13 years, it radically increases the risk that Iran will deploy nuclear weapons. And so today we have some breathing room, but looking to the future, as a result of that agreement, there's a significantly greater risk that Iran will choose a nuclear future. And if that happens, we need to give a lot of thought to what we say to Saudi Arabia, what we say to the United Arab Emirates, what we say to Turkey, to persuade them not to produce their own nuclear weapons.
So I'd like to respond to a few of the things that Steve said on, first I'd like to return back to Iran because I think that's so important. And it's obviously an issue that's on the front burner of our domestic political debate and the deliberations within the Trump administration. So to step back again, to explain to a broader audience, Iran is a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And as Steve said, it has a civil nuclear program and for years has been suspected or known to be pursuing a nuclear weapons program. What was accomplished in the Obama administration was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was an agreement negotiated with Iran and all the United States, China, Russia, UK, France, and Germany, with IAEA involvement in terms of the verification procedures to to put Iran's civil nuclear program under strict controls and to get rid of aspects of it that were thought to be contributing to the nuclear weapons program. So a huge number of centrifuges, 98%, I think, of its stockpile of highly enriched uranium, which is weapons usable material. The agreement has strict verification procedures which go way beyond what's required of other non-nuclear weapon states in good standing with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Some of those procedures extend for 25 years. As Steve mentioned, some provisions of the agreement expire in 10 or 15 years. And so it does give extremely important breathing room, assuming that Iran remains in compliance with the agreement, to forestall any movement toward a nuclear weapon program. And I would make the case that it's really in our interest to continue this agreement, hold Iran to its obligations, meet ours in it as well, which have to do with sanctions relief, and then start to plan on what to do when the agreement, when aspects of the agreement expire. But it's not unusual in international law and treaties and agreements to have treaties of limited duration. I mean, most of the agreements between the United States and Russia, for instance, governing our strategic nuclear weapons have had limited durations, and they've usually been succeeded by other agreements. So I would say that it's critical to maintain this agreement. And I'd also, let me just take some water here. Sorry. I'd say that this is really the national security equivalent of the healthcare debate that's going on right now, which is to say that if you want to repeal and replace or just repeal the JCPOA, there's really a burden to say, what one would do in its place and why that would be better, especially when we have the other partners I just mentioned who remain parties to this agreement. And as long as Iran is complying with it, we'll continue to uphold the agreement, which would make us just an outlier if we in any way seek to pull out or torpedo it.
Well, let's make a little.
We should also return to North Korea.
I was going to say, let's make an agenda for this discussion,
okay,
and we'll set aside Obamacare and focus on WMD proliferation and security. Should we talk first about North Korea and then Iran, and then some of the other items that you identified first, and then also talk about the extent to which the NPT and other instruments of international law can play a role in dealing with some of these problems. So let's start with North Korea. How serious is that problem today, Steve?
Well, I think the North Korea problem is extraordinarily serious. as you pointed out, Lynn, North Korea did at one point sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They also signed a separate agreement, a bilateral agreement with South Korea, promising not to have enrichment or reprocessing technology, these are the two technologies that can be used to produce the fissile material which one needs to build a nuclear weapon. So under that agreement, they shouldn't even be producing plutonium or highly enriched uranium. And then under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which they signed, they should never have produced nuclear weapons. They formally pulled out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They never pulled out of that bilateral agreement. It's still in place, but they never abided by it either. Today, they have nuclear weapons, which is a serious concern, but it's an even greater concern for the United States because today they are testing missiles of increasingly long range. And the only purpose for these longer range missiles is to deliver nuclear warheads against targets at greater distance. Most recently, they tested a missile that could reach Alaska. Clearly, they want to be able to reach the continental United States as well. And this is why the North Korea issue is receiving so much attention today, because it's the combination of the fact that they do have nuclear weapons, and now they're trying to perfect the means of delivery to be able to attack the United States with nuclear weapons. And what's the solution? Well, I've followed this issue very closely since the beginning, and and I want to be fair to everybody who's participated in the struggle to stop North Korea's progress. As a country, we've tried everything. We've tried engagement. That was the Clinton policy, and he signed an agreement with the North Koreans, and it would have restrained their program. The problem was we caught them cheating on the agreement. That happened in the early Bush administration. So the Bush administration, in which I served, adopted a much more confrontational policy. They imposed sanctions and with some effect, but the response of the North Koreans was to test their first nuclear weapon. When that happened, actually then Bush changed his policy. He went back to trying to engage again. And under his administration, the last couple of years, they signed some additional bilateral agreements with North Korea. One would have thought if engagement was a solution, maybe that was going to lead somewhere. But President Obama came in, and honestly, I think they looked at what had actually been achieved in the late Bush administration and decided it wasn't very much, that the obligations imposed on North Korea were not significant, and there was a question about whether they would comply with them. So by the end of the Obama administration, they had switched. They weren't doing confrontation or engagement. They were doing essentially benign neglect. They called it strategic patience. That was the label for the policy, which was not. It actually was a strategic policy in the sense that I think they bought the notion that the term that was sometimes used by experts was that North Korea's nuclear weapons program was a cry for help, that they wanted the world to pay attention to them. And so what do you do with a child that is acting up as a cry for help? Well, you ignore the child in hopes that teaches the child that maybe that kind of behavior is not going to be rewarded. So I think that was essentially the Obama policy. Kind of look the other way, ignore them, and hope that would teach them a lesson. That didn't work either. So engagement didn't work, confrontation didn't work, ignoring the problem didn't work, and
Can I get a word in edgewise?
Well, let me just finish my thought.
These are like filibusters, not short answers.
So Trump is now in office, and I think looking at a more confrontational policy, he has correctly come to the conclusion that the key to solving the problem is China. If China can be persuaded to really engage, they have the leverage with North Korea to make progress. But every administration has figured that out, and the Chinese have consistently been asked to do more, and they've consistently, as a matter of their own national security calculus, decided they're not prepared to do more. And so I'm actually skeptical that Trump will be able to come in with some argument or some threat or some promise to the Chinese that will lead them to come down in a different place.
So, I don't agree with everything Steve said, but I certainly agree with kind of the underlying idea that North Korea has been one of the most vexing national security challenges our country has faced for decades now. And, at least 4 different administrations of both parties have wrestled with it. And meanwhile, the North Korean nuclear and missile programs have progressed, and its proliferant activities around the world have progressed, which are highly problematic, both for the spread of materials, but also because that's one way in which it generates income to support and its indigenous programs. I will say that I don't think it's fair to characterize the Obama administration as policy as whatever the term you used, as sort of passively
Strategic
benign.
patience.
Well, no, it was strategic. They did use the term strategic, but it wasn't benign neglect. I think it was somewhat strategic patience on the sort of, at some point, not pursuing active diplomacy, but there was a very vigorous efforts to impose and enforce sanctions around the world to, to keep North Korea from undertaking the activities that it does that are both so dangerous and also, as I say, generate revenue to support its programs. I will say, I think it's a little hard to understand actually how different the Trump policy is from the previous administration policy, despite rhetoric, and that's not really a criticism. It's partly a recognition of how difficult the problem is, and there are. But I was just going to make the one point that they do seem to be, from what I've read, they are also making a very vigorous effort on the enforcement aspect, and that is really a global challenge. And for instance, North Korea does a lot of trade with countries in Africa, and it's always a challenge to elevate to the top of the bilateral agenda with countries around the world with whom we have lots of other issues. For instance, something like North Korea. And if they're succeeding in elevating that in the bilateral agenda with every country around the world to encourage them to stop trade, stop hiring, North Korean workers, all of that, that's positive. In general, the tools that you're left with are a combination of pressure, and that's both, it's economic pressure, it's diplomatic pressure. And the point of the pressure, though, is to stop or deter behavior, and also try to bring them to the table. Now, it's hard to be optimistic because, as Steve says, there's a long, history of negotiations that have either yielded, some short-term, gains or freezes in their programs, but ultimately didn't succeed in the longer-term objective of completely stopping their programs or denuclearizing. But I think we have to not give up on directing the pressure towards the, a desired outcome of getting North Korea to the point where it's willing to engage in a dialogue and potentially diplomacy. The military options are all extremely unattractive.
Let me ask the question the hardest way. Is this impossible?
Yeah.
Is there any method that would convince the Kim regime to give up their nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the question. The premise of U.S. policy for most of the last 2 or 3 decades has been that ultimately this is a subject for diplomacy, that there's a bargain to be struck with the North Koreans on this. I personally have come to the conclusion that there's not, that at least if the idea is to denuclearize North Korea, that's not something they've been interested in at any point. And in fact, they have written into their constitution that they are a nuclear armed state. I mean, I think at a certain point we need to take the North Koreans at their word. They are determined to have nuclear weapons. This is not a bargaining chip. There's not some combination of sanctions or U.S. assistance that will lead them to negotiate the denuclearization of North Korea. And so I think so long as there's a North Korean regime, and I am hopeful that one day there will stop being a North Korean regime, because there aren't many regimes like that have survived over the long term. But as long as there's a North Korean regime, I think it's my personal view is they're going to have nuclear weapons. I think they're just committed to that. And so I think fundamentally, unless China can be persuaded to use the leverage they have to compel the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons, and again, I think recent history, not just recent history, history of the last 20 or 30 years, suggests they're not prepared to use that leverage against what they consider an ideologically compatible regime on their border. Absent that, I think we are stuck with a nuclear-armed North Korea, and we need to design our policies accordingly. And I think that means, most importantly, being attentive to the requirements, the fears of our allies in Japan and Korea. They need to be confident that America is there to protect them. If they lose that confidence, I think there's a risk that in both cases they may deploy their own nuclear weapons. So we need that, the security, the reliability of the American nuclear deterrent is absolutely critical to making sure that nuclear proliferation in Northeast Asia is limited just to North Korea and doesn't expand to both South Korea and Japan. If either of those countries loses their confidence in the reliability of the American nuclear umbrella, both of them have the technology to produce their own nuclear weapons, and we don't want that to happen. That would be the worst development ever for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But beyond that, missile defenses, making sure our allies have their own capabilities to deter North Korea, short of nuclear weapons, but conventional deterrent capabilities to demonstrate to the North Koreans that they could strike back if attacked. I think all of that's important to dealing with what I think is going to be a persistent long-term problem of a nuclear-armed North Korea.
Lynn, do you see it the same way?
Well, I probably in some nuances. I mean, I certainly agree that extended deterrence is an important part of reassuring our allies who face a real and current threat from North Korea. I suspect, I'm not sure this is a place to get into it, that Steve and I might have different views on, what's required to, assure them to have confidence in our extended deterrent. I mean, what North Korea is really most concerned about is regime survival, and it clearly sees nuclear weapons as the ticket to that end. Whether there's any possibility of, in the long run, persuading them that their survival doesn't, require the continued pursuit of nuclear weapons. That's kind of the diplomatic, question.
Can you see an answer to that? Can you see getting to yes? Can you imagine, absent regime change in North Korea or absent some turnabout in China's attitude? Can you see the Kim regime giving up?
Again, I mean, I see China a little different. I mean, there's no question that China is a key to, both the carrot and the sticks aspect of trying to curb North Korea's behavior and bring it to the table. And obviously Japan and Korea, as well as Russia, actually the whole six-party gang is going to have to be part of any kind of diplomatic solution, and it would be long-term and comprehensive to kind of address all these issues, including some kind of guarantees to the survival of the regime and a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And again, I mean, in all fairness, this has all been tried before, but that, those are the elements that would have to be part of a negotiation. I mean, it's a very tough thing, and the record in the past does not give us high hope, and yet there has to be a diplomatic a diplomatic piece of this that is pursued in conjunction with deterrence, defense.
Although I think you'd have to acknowledge that part of the reason that the Obama administration resorted to a policy of strategic patience, which meant basically not paying too much attention as their nuclear and missile programs continued to advance, was because the Obama administration concluded that there really wasn't much hope for active diplomacy. That they wanted North Korea to commit to the idea that the object of negotiations was to come to some understanding under which they would give up nuclear weapons, and the North Koreans were pretty adamant that no, that was not.
Well, and that actually leads me to another point, which is, there's a debate on whether a freeze as an initial step is or is not in a worthwhile endeavor. I mean, I would say a freeze on a North Korean program, would be advantageous because it's better than allowing these programs to advance.
But why didn't the Obama administration pursue a freeze?
Well, they did, and then the leap day deal,
which was in what year?
Fell apart.
2010.
I can't remember.
But I mean, for years, the Obama administration policy was.
Let me ask another aspect of this. You think there is if diplomacy seems, at least for the immediate future, to be a dead end, that leaves us with a military response, some sort of preemptive strike, or some form of deterrence.
Right. Yeah, and I agree with Lynn, and the notion that there is some military solution where the United States can surgically attack the North Korean nuclear program, and that the consequences of that will not be catastrophic for us and for our allies in the region. I think that notion is wrong. I mean, I think there's a reason. Every administration has looked at the military option, and every administration has come to the conclusion that it's too risky, too costly, and I don't think the Trump administration in the end will come to a different conclusion, because the military calculus has not changed. And so that leaves diplomacy, which even the Obama administration chose not to pursue for most of its duration, and or the deterrence/containment model, which is the one that I think is the one that we need to resort to.
Well, no, I think we should probably, well, I'll just say, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both. Even if you're skeptical about the prospects for success, but I think diplomacy is an essential, element, and I think our allies in the region will insist on it, as they should, in terms of exploring the possibilities.
So just before we move on to Iran, let me ask one more North Korea related question that would apply to Iran as well. Is the Kim regime deterrable? Can we in fact live with a North Korean nuclear weapon, including a North Korean ICBM capability, the way we've learned to live with those capabilities in the form of the Soviet Union and Russia and China? Is not a comfortable, not a happy solution, but is that a possible scenario for the next decades?
My answer to that is I think we better hope that that's a viable solution, because I think it's probably the only realistic solution, the only realistic policy we have. I do think, between the combination of missile defenses and at least the limited technology that North Korea has now and over the next, hopefully for the next decade or so, at best they would be able to bloody our nose, but we would obliterate them. And for a regime whose principal priority is regime survival, being obliterated is kind of a bad outcome. So I think we need policies in place that make absolutely clear to them that they will be obliterated if they choose to enter into a nuclear war with us or with our allies in the region.
Should we maybe move on to more broadly? Because I think we spent a lot of time on Iran and North Korea.
Okay, if you've got something to say about the broader topic, sure.
Well, I thought, should we talk a little bit about the threat of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism, the nexus, or?
Well, I had in mind a little bit more commentary about the NPT and the role of international law in the form of arms control and other tools about the other list. And maybe we'll talk about the treaties first and then turn to the nexus with non-state actors. Steve, you described the NPT earlier. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role that document has played? Well,
I think it's a vitally important treaty. I mean, the reason we're able to complain about the North Korean nuclear program or the Iranian nuclear program is because for them to, either of those countries, well, certainly in the case of Iran, which today accepts that it's subject to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, for them to have a nuclear weapons program violates their obligations under that treaty. And so that's an important, not just an important talking point, it's an important legal point for us to make in trying to maintain international pressure on Iran not to go down the nuclear path. So keeping the treaty around is very much in our interest. Now, I think so every 5 years they have a review conference where all the parties get together, and these review conferences are fairly predictable in the way they unfold, because a lot of the countries show up at the conference and instead of wanting to talk about Iran and instead of wanting to talk about North Korea, what they want to talk, or India or Pakistan, or China, which is the one nuclear weapon state, one of the 5 nuclear weapon states that is most dramatically investing in expanding their nuclear capabilities. A lot of countries show up and they want to talk about the United States and Russia and Britain and France and accuse us of violating our obligations under the treaty in the area of nuclear disarmament. I think the United States traditionally has done a pitiful job defending itself against those charges, because the fundamental charge is completely ill-founded legally. It's based on a misreading of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But the United States, for whatever reason, and the other nuclear weapon states, for whatever reason, choose not to remind the other countries what the actual legal obligations of the nuclear weapon states are under it's Article 6
So,
of the treaty that applies here. But the last 4 or 5 of these review conferences have basically turned into kind of food fights between the nuclear weapon states and everybody else, which kind of misses the point of the real threat to the treaty, which is the Irans.
So can we maybe back up and again for our audience and talk a little bit about the treaty? I mean, you did it when we first began, but I mean, the treaty is built on 3 pillars. The first pillar is non-proliferation. The second pillar is peaceful uses of nuclear peaceful uses of nuclear energy, excuse me. And the third is disarmament. And so as it's been said, when the treaty was negotiated, there were 5 states that were recognized as nuclear weapon states. And the rest of the treaty parties acceded as non-nuclear weapon states. So the fundamental obligation first is that the non-nuclear weapon states not to acquire or pursue or possess nuclear weapons, and the nuclear weapon states undertake activities to prevent the proliferation of technology to them. There's also a commitment to encourage or support the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, but to do that in a way that's safeguarded and monitored by the IA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to make sure that the civilian nuclear programs are not being diverted for military purposes. And there's Article 6, which is the obligation of the nuclear weapon states parties to the treaty to pursue steps toward disarmament and the ultimate goal of complete and general disarmament. So what has happened in recent years is increasing frustration that we've seen on the part of the non-nuclear weapon states, that the pace of progress in their view in terms of the disarmament commitment has not been fast enough. And that's part of what spawned what's called the Nuclear Ban Treaty that was just passed recently, with treaty seeking to prohibit nuclear weapons.
I'm wondering if either of you had any experiences during your time in government where the fact that the NPT is a treaty, that it's binding international law, made a difference in the diplomatic program, the different diplomatic progress, either inside the United States or dealing with other countries.
Well, I think, it's the central legal instrument in this whole area, and a lot of other policies revolve around it. Policies of enormous practical importance. There's a thing called the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which is countries with civil nuclear technology. They've gotten together and they agree to limit the transfer of that kind of technology to countries where there's a concern that they might be seeking nuclear weapons in violation of the NPT. I think without the NPT, getting agreement to have those kinds of restrictions on the transfer of technology, by international consensus would be much harder. During the Bush administration, we developed a concept called the Proliferation Security Initiative, which was a much more active policy of trying to physically interdict transfers of that kind of technology to countries of concern. And by physically interdict, I mean stopping ships on the high seas and boarding them and searching to see if they contained this sort of technology. And this was an incredibly important policy, because if you look at what happened in Libya, it was actually a shipboarding pursuant to the Proliferation Security Initiative, which provided the first incontrovertible evidence that Libya was pursuing nuclear weapons. There was a ship called the BBC China that turned out to have centrifuges of Pakistani design manufactured in Malaysia being shipped to Libya. And there was no, this was contrary to Libya's obligations under the NPT. There was no explaining this away. I mean, it was a Proliferation Security Initiative that brought forth that evidence, and I don't think other countries would have cooperated in the Proliferation Security Initiative, which is a fairly dramatic step to stop ships on the high seas, without the ability to rely on the NPT as a legal justification for doing that kind of thing.
Lynn, how much trouble is the NPT in these days? We talked about the antagonism between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states, and the way the recent review conferences have been agitated over Article 6 and other aspects as well. Is the regime and the treaty itself in danger?
Well, I hope not. I mean, there are definitely growing, divisions between the nuclear and the non-nuclear weapon states, as I say, over the pace of disarmament activities. And then another area that's been traditionally a concern has to do with the aspiration of states in the Middle East for Arab states in the Middle East for a Middle East nuclear weapons free zone. And since the review conference, the NPT review conference in 2010, there have been efforts to organize a conference to discuss that, which would include Israel, and Israel being one of the parties thought to have nuclear weapons that is not a party to the NPT. So those are the two issues that have caused a lot of division over the years. To me, we have to, well, I would say that one thing is that the nuclear weapon states, need to maintain their commitment and to continue trying as circumstances permit to make step-by-step progress on steps toward disarmament. There are also things that can be done. For instance, the State Department and actually the Nuclear Threat Initiative jointly have been working on a multilateral international partnership for nuclear disarmament verification, which is to try to bring together nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states representatives to talk about and study the technologies and methods that are needed for verification of nuclear disarmament, and that's a productive path. I think the most positive thing that's happened for the NPT is the Iran agreement. I mean, I think this is an example of one of the most, troubling cases that the international community was concerned about, and we were able to, partly because of the NPT, galvanize the international community to jointly impose sanctions that were sufficient to basically change Iran's calculus on this, and now work with us and the IAEA to bring its civil nuclear program under safeguards and verification and monitoring that goes way beyond what's required in the NPT. So to me, I mean, that's an example where the treaty and the its kind of galvanizing power has been very effective.
Steve, we've identified a couple of other kinds of legal tools that maybe the audience would be interested in hearing a little bit more about. Can you say anything about nuclear weapons free zone treaties?
That's a sort of regional concept where, they're essentially nuclear non-proliferation treaties for regions of the world, and countries in a region decide to I would argue that they're typically a belt and suspenders kind of thing, because every country that signs up to a nuclear weapons free zone is already party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they're just undertaking a second and somewhat redundant legal obligation not to acquire nuclear weapons. I don't think they're unhelpful necessarily, but I don't think they're a panacea either. The problem isn't all of the countries that are committed to not possessing nuclear weapons and committed to the idea of abolishing them from the planet. The problem is that the very small number of countries, which for their own reasons have decided nuclear weapons are a solution to the problems that they consider that they face. I do want to respond to you on Iran. I'm sorry, I know you tried to change the subject, but the Iran nuclear deal, speaking of non-panaceas, I mean, it's short term, it's fine. I mean, it buys us some breathing space, but long term, it is a disaster for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so what was the argument that the Obama administration made to sell it to the Congress? And they failed to sell it to the Congress, by the way. Majorities in both houses of Congress voted to reject the deal. It was considered by Congress under a procedure where super majorities, a 2/3 majority of both houses, would have been required to block it. And super majorities were not achieved, but clear majorities of the House and Senate voted to reject this deal after carefully evaluating it. The argument that the administration made was, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this was 2 years ago, that we faced a situation where Iran's time for nuclear breakout, the amount of time it would take from a standing start for them to produce their first nuclear weapon, was down to about 2 months. And that was unacceptably short. And the object of the JCPOA, the Iran deal, was to increase that time period for Iranian nuclear breakout to 1 year. And
it's one of the benefits of it.
And I'm not here to quarrel that was achieved for the initial 10-year period. And that was considered a huge win, increasing breakout time from 2 months, which was considered unacceptably short, to 1 year. But it was President Obama himself who conceded in an NPR interview that after the 13th year of the JCPOA, Iran's nuclear breakout time would reduce to almost zero. And that's a consequence of the way the deal is structured. And that's why I say that in the long term, it's a disaster, because if 2 months was unacceptably short as an Iranian nuclear breakout time 2 years ago, the idea that in 13 years, which 13 years from 2 years ago, so 11 years from today, we can be comfortable with an Iranian nuclear breakout time of almost zero, which is what this agreement ensures, and that we will have no ability to complain about that, because we promised to give up the sanctions. We promised and fulfilled the obligation to repeal the UN Security Council resolutions that prohibited Iran from achieving that kind of breakout capability. In 11 years, we're going to rue the day that we entered this deal, and it's a huge problem that the Obama administration bequeathed to future U.S. administrations.
So that's actually a good segue to, if I may, to recommendations, right?
I know we've got so many things to talk about.
I got to respond.
We can't resist talking about Iran, so we do want to turn to forward-looking, but let's deal with Iran first.
Well, can I do both?
Sure.
So, because as I see the time, and I am going to, in terms of recommendations for the Trump administration. And first I'd like to make a broader point, and then my next one will be on Iran. And my broader point is there's no such thing as leadership a la carte. And the point being, U.S. global leadership and working with allies and partners is an essential ingredient to making progress on any of these issues, and frankly, most of the issues that we deal with in national security that require cooperation with other countries to solve difficult problems. And so we are not going to make the kind of progress and have people with us in an environment where we're dissing our allies, walking away from agreements like Paris Climate Accord, and potentially trying to jettison the JCPOA with Iran, and then expect to have allies and partners with us as we try to accomplish other things in the world. So, we really need a much more strategic and less transactional approach to national security and foreign policy in general. Having made that point, and again, Steve and I are just going to agree to disagree, but I think it's the Hippocratic oath of do no harm on the agreement with Iran. I think it's national security malpractice to do anything other than keep it in force and hold Iran's feet to the fire. And as I say, I don't agree with everything you asserted about the out years for the agreement, but the point is, if we have a track record of enforcement of this agreement and Iran abiding by its commitment, then the thing to do is to build on it for the years beyond. And some of the verification aspects of it, by the way, extend 25 years. And the last thing I'll say on the recommendation front, although it's an area that we didn't really get into, but in my view, it does relate also to our non-proliferation objectives, is the nuclear posture review that the administration is undertaking. I think it's critical that we continue as a key element of our nuclear policy, the commitment to the long-term, goal and objective of nuclear disarmament, and to, continuing to reduce the role and number of nuclear weapons in our national security strategy, and continuing as conditions permit, and frankly, trying to create the conditions to continue to make, progress in that. And one last thing that's, related more broadly has to do with our dealings with Russia on things nuclear. And there's just a desperate need for more political space to be able to look for ways to work with Russia specifically to reduce and manage nuclear threats, even in this environment where, the relationships are strained, the politics of it in our country are very difficult, for all the reasons people know in terms of the, Russian interference in our election. And
Steve, I want to turn to you for,
I'll leave it on that.
for looking forward. But Lynn, could you mentioned the nuclear posture review? Maybe you could explain for the audience just what that is.
I don't want to take Steve's time. The administration is undertaking a review, as frankly every administration normally does when it first comes in terms of what our posture should be, what are our requirements for nuclear weapons, how many, what kinds, the modernization programs. There's usually an element that has to do with declaratory policy. And the baseline right now, of course, is the posture review that was done in the Obama administration in 2010. They're now reviewing that and a whole set of issues. And there are indicators that they'll be looking at some departures from the Obama administration policy, and some which I would argue could be very corrosive to our non-proliferation objectives.
Thank you. Steve, looking forward.
So, yeah, thank you. So first of all, I'll change the order that I was going to offer these in. First, on the nuclear posture review, that is an important exercise where basically the U.S., fundamentally the U.S. military makes a judgment about the numbers and types of nuclear weapons we need going forward. That pretty much every administration comes into office and undertakes one of these reviews, and then there are a lot of implications for arms control that follow from it.
Which is why it shouldn't only be a DoD enterprise. It should be a whole of government enterprise.
Well, it is a whole of government enterprise,
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, we're talking about weapons that are in the inventory of the Department of Defense, and they're the ones who develop the war plans, and it is actually driven by the war plan.
Which is driven by political guidance, but
that
should come from the president.
So reclaiming my time, it's a very important exercise. I do think in the Trump administration and in all administrations, the fundamental guiding principle needs to be the recognition that the number one tool, the most effective tool, not just today, but for the entire post-World War II era, the most powerful tool of nuclear nonproliferation has been the reliability, the credibility of the U.S. nuclear deterrent. I mean, if you want to, why does Germany not have nuclear weapons today? Why does Sweden not have nuclear weapons? Sweden had a nuclear weapons program in the 1950s. Why did they give up their nuclear weapons program? They looked around and they decided, the Americans will defend us. We don't need nuclear weapons because the Americans have nuclear weapons, and so we can give up our nuclear weapons program. There are a lot of idealists running around saying, well, America should just give up its nuclear weapons. They haven't thought through, what does South Korea do if America gives up its nuclear weapons? Now, if America and North Korea give up their nuclear weapons, then maybe South Korea is okay with that. But I think you'd have to be extraordinarily naive to think that Kim Jong-un would be inspired by an American decision to give up nuclear weapons, that would lead him to think he should give up his nuclear weapons too. I would argue, actually, given the psychology there, the result would likely be the opposite. He would think, well, if I can be the only country on earth with nuclear weapons, absolutely, bring it on. So, in today's world, the idea that abandoning America's nuclear deterrent, that's going to lead to a safer world, I think is lunacy. We need a reliable, credible nuclear deterrent to persuade other countries that otherwise would feel threatened by the nuclear weapons of North Korea, Iran, China, Russia, to not consider the nuclear option for themselves. So that needs to be the guiding principle of the nuclear posture review. With regard, I mean, it was interesting to hear you on Russia. I personally favor a better relationship with Russia. And interestingly, Donald Trump ran for office favoring a better relationship with Russia. The result has been an incredible backlash on the Congress, which is doubling down on U.S. sanctions and basically making it almost impossible for the president to lift the U.S. sanctions. So if we have time at the end, I'd like to hear your reaction to what Congress is doing in the area of U.S.-Russian relations and the consequences of that for potential consequences of that for nuclear arms control. But on Iran and North Korea, which I wanted to touch on, North Korea, I think I've been clear. I think we need to resort to a policy of deterrence and containment because I don't think we should deceive ourselves into believing that North Korea is going to be persuaded to abandon nuclear weapons anytime soon. And in the case of Iran, let me just say, I would characterize U.S. policy under the Obama administration with respect to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action as over-compliance by the U.S. and toleration of under-compliance by Iran. I think there's a lot of evidence that that was the policy. I think under the Trump administration, I do not advocate walking away tomorrow from the Iran nuclear deal, but I think we have to, the policy has to be one of strict compliance. Iran will be strictly held accountable for complying with its obligations, and we shouldn't be making unilateral concessions to keep them happy.
So I am afraid that we are out of time. I'm not sure we've managed to solve any of the problems, but perhaps it's been a contribution to elucidating what they are. On behalf of Stephen Rademacher and Lynn Rustin, I'm David Koplow, and want to thank you all for your participation and hope you'll be tuning into the other aspects of future programs on international law and the Trump administration.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks to our speakers, Stephen Rademacher and Lynn Rustin, for an informative and lively discussion that certainly highlighted the key issues and the challenges that we face in this area, and also helped us understand better the contributions that the international law framework has made to this area. So we're very grateful to the whole group of you for this discussion. I'd also like to thank the Society's Executive Director, Mark Agrast, and our dedicated staff for all their contributions to this series. And thanks to you, our audience. We hope you found this webcast informative and useful. If you'd like to view it again or share it with others, the link will be available shortly on our website, www.asil.org/Trump. They're also available in podcast form, so you have the option of listening or viewing. Please join us for the next installment of this free series. It will take place on Monday, September 11th at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time, 8:30 a.m. Pacific Time. Our topic will be the use of force under international law, and will once again feature a terrific lineup of speakers. Thank you.